I am a science. Today we'll be looking at a scientific paper from 2012 entitled Hypermasculinity Dickwolves, the Contentious Role of Women in the New Gaming Public. And this was brought back to my attention in the aftermath, I suppose you'd call it, of the Jeremy Hambley thumping, which prompted me to try and reopen lines of dialogue across the cultural divide we seem to find ourselves in. Of course, for my trouble, I was lectured, hectored, and people engaged in exactly the same sort of nonsense that created this gulf in the first place. It wasn't particularly edifying. I have a couple of conversations coming up that may prove more useful. This included demanding that I read this paper, which I already had years before. If I didn't read the paper, they wouldn't continue the discussion. However, when I told them to read my book on Gamergate, they were not willing and instead launched into bigging themselves up as some sort of scholar. Well, there's a number of issues with this paper. First, the title misdiagnoses the problem. Second, the paper fails to properly contextualize events or gaming culture. And third, it's social science.
It's not an exact science.
It's not even science.
Social science is barely a science. It's certainly not hard science. If you were to assemble a league table of science from hard to soft, social science would occupy a space somewhere between astrology and alchemy, in that it has some slight basis, but there's really issues. There are all manner of problems which bedevil the social sciences. These include a lack of academic rigour, a hostility to peer review, and a much looser and less meaningful application of the very idea of peer review when it is included. Basically, my mates also read this in a lot of instances. Then there's the problem with activist science. Even in the harder sciences, this can be a problem. You need only consider how petroleum companies fund research into climate, and in the past how cigarette companies would fund research into the alleged link between cigarettes and cancer. Starting from a conclusion and working towards that conclusion, selecting evidence that supports what you're trying to show, that's what dishonest corporate shills and creationists do, and it's also what a lot of activists do. Now, technically speaking, what I've just done there is a poisoning the well fallacy, but we're not dealing with hard and fast facts here, like the speed of light or something. We're dealing with the arena of human opinion, and as such, as we do in studying history, we should always consider the source and their biases, and keep them in mind when we examine what they're saying. So, back to this glorified opinion piece masquerading as a scientific paper. The issue which it alleges to examine is around a controversy that engulfed Penny Arcade, an online comic. Amongst other things, they've diversified their business. Smart cookies. A joke of theirs about MMORPGs drew the ire of an early beta build of social justice warriors. At the risk of destroying the joke presented here, it's probably a good idea to explain it for those who aren't necessarily steeped in gaming culture. In massive multiplayer online role-playing games, there are often what are called fetch quests. A non-player character will assign a quest to your character to go to a location and to collect a certain number of things. E.g., go to Morning Wood and return with a dozen severed bear asses. Variations exist to this one, one of them being rescue 10 prisoners from the mines, or something similar to that, something along those lines. The thing is, these quests remain available forever, and new prisoners are constantly being spawned by the program, so that other players can do the same quest, rescue the same prisoners. Engagement with the story behind this is minimal, if anything. You can make no actual difference to the world by doing this. You're just ticking the right number of boxes to complete the quest, get your experience points and your gold and perhaps a nice shiny item of some description. The comic illustrates the disconnect between the story and the mechanics. The hero here having saved his requisite number of prisoners to complete the quest, so he's leaving, while the next prisoner in line, not perhaps unreasonably, begs for more assistance as though he were a real person, and speaks of his plight to the uncaring hero trying to convince him to rescue the rest of them. The disconnect is where the humour is, between the expectation and the reality, between the narrative and the mechanics, along with the hyperbolic explanation of the plight of the prisoner, which included being raped to sleep by dickwolves. Sounds pretty horrific. So this joke went out, in their tradition of jokes, and an individual, apocryphally a rape victim themselves, took issue with this joke. Specifically the raped to sleep by dickwolves bit, and they attacked Penny Arcade for it. This then blew up into your typical internet shitstorm, with sides approximating the authoritarian-libertarian divide that's now so familiar to us from Gamergate, Comicsgate, Sad Puppies, Star Wars, Ghostbusters, and it goes on and on and on. Well, familiar, I would hope. Disinformation about all of these and slander of the people involved in them, calling them far right and so on, reactionary, etc, etc. Yeah, all that disinformation is rife. In fact, most of these movements are predominantly, or at least include, people of a more left libertarian bent who rankle at censorship. I myself am very firmly on the far left, and I rankle at censorship because of those ideals. Contextually, you need to understand that gaming, of which Penny Arcade is a cultural artifact, has a long history of being demonized and censored by authoritarians, as well as of fighting back against that censorship. It was and is a male-dominated culture, especially within the term gamer, which tends to be more hardcore and excludes casual gaming of the kind you might engage in on your mobile phone. And this culture has, over decades, established a set of cultural norms. Penny Arcade in particular, it must be remembered, has a reputation for edgy humour. You don't go to Penny Arcade expecting something milquetoast. I promise we won't go through the whole paper because, well, that's as tedious as the end game of Monopoly. We'll just hit the high or low notes that demonstrate its flaws and why it should not remotely be taken as seriously as it has been. It's been cited and quoted a lot. So first, let's look at the abstract of the paper, as this kind of sums the whole thing up. As video games have attracted more critical attention and theoretical discourse, and games play a more visible part in our media landscape, the modern video game community impacts the wider world of online culture and warrants more detailed study. Using the case of the Dickwolves incident from Penny Arcade, the authors address issues of hypermasculinity and sexism within the gaming community, and how this lens brings to light issues with a hostile response to the expression of a female identity or femininity. The authors argue that this case highlights how the hypermasculine discourse encourages the overt privileging of masculinity over femininity and discourages women from engaging in gendered discourse within the community. Lens, that's basically an admission of bias. Now, there's a lot to unpick already, but since I spent so much time on the preamble, I'll attempt to be brief, though it's not my strong suit. Critical attention here is contestable. Here they're referring to people like Anita Sarkeesian, who claim to be game and cultural critics, but who are actually attempting to be moral arbiters of the gaming space. They don't engage in criticism, but rather they test games for purity against an ideological standard. You may not agree. Gentlemen can differ. Theoretical discourse is not quite as corrupted in this way, but if anyone remembers the various Digra leaks and exposés that took place during Gamergate, you'll see it's rife there too, particularly the hostility to peer review and so forth. Unfortunately, gamers as a whole just aren't interested in this kind of analysis, because when they experience it, it has always been this kind of corrupt analysis, not what makes a game good, but how does it offend the author's sensibilities. And so the whole field is left primarily to the ideologically motivated. It's a shame. As a game designer myself, I might find some of this academic examination useful if it wasn't all this hyper-partisan activism. Hypermasculinity and sexism are assumptions, and as a bias from the start. It's a claim that is much more contestable than it might seem. To use a rather silly analogy, if you arrest a woman for murder, then it's not sexism. It's the same reaction a man might get if he murders someone. In reality, she would probably likely get a lighter sentence, but that's, by the by, that's a separate issue for another time. If you cast aspersions, and they get cast back, it's because of the aspersions you're casting. It's not because of your race, your gender, your sexuality, or anything else you care to mention. It's nothing to do with your identity, it's to do with your actions. Hypermasculinity is a psychological term for exaggerated acting out of male-coded behaviours and characteristics. Strength, physical aggression, sexuality, etc. But we're talking about nerds. 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 These people read a hostile response to censorious and authoritarian attempts at censorship as sexism because the person being reacted to, at least initially, was presumably female, rather than as what they were, a response to attempts at censorship. These responses coming from a community steeped in resistance to censorship that goes at least back to the 80s, probably further, and resistance to authoritarianism in attempts to censor and control the consumption of gaming media. In summation, the gaming community, and much of the online community as a whole, because this is really a part of internet culture as well, reacts in this way because you're being a cunt, not because you have one. Really, that's all that needs to be said. Just debunking the abstract and demonstrating the bias and intent of the authors of the paper causes the rest to collapse like a house of bacon-greased cards. But a few other points are probably still worth making. There is, for example, a large section attempting to establish this hypermasculinity idea when we're talking about nerds. Nerds. We're talking about nerds. And to do this, they look at the characters that appear in some high-profile games, whilst ignoring games that don't fit that profile or that mould. I mean, Mario is hardly the epitome of alpha masculinity, and he's one of the biggest gaming characters, the biggest gaming icons of all time. And he's a short, dumpy guy with a crap mustache. At the root of this is, in part, I think, a disconnect between the activist and the gamer. Activists of this ilk are obsessed by representation and identity, while multiple studies that have been done into gamers and games, gaming and gaming characters show that gamers don't tend to care too much what their avatar is in the game. They're there to engage with the game as a mechanism beyond the avatar. So they don't care, but activist pseudo-scholars do very much. You will find gamers reacting with hostility to box-ticking forced diversity, but game characters have always been diverse. And this is reflective, this resistance, of a desire for quality rather than sexism or racism or homophobia or whatever other buzzword you want to accuse people of being hated, full of hate over. In the next section, they talk about how the arena might be hostile to women, rather than simply being a predominantly masculine space. And they fail to acknowledge the many, if a minority, but many women, racial minorities, etc., etc., who occupy the gaming space, the online space, without any real issue. While the demography of the gaming space is changing via the increased social acceptability of gaming as a hobby and the proliferation of casual gaming via the mobile phone space, the gamer scene has long been male-dominated and has developed social norms and behaviours and circumlocutions and memes and little tics and so on according to that history. The writers of this article fail to understand that in this context, what they're advocating for is colonialism. It's the colonisation of the gaming space and the enforcement of new social norms upon a pre-existing community. The kind of thing they would normally be protesting if it happened in meat space. I mean, the whole thing is, in essence, a form of internet imperialism. But I guess it's okay when they do it. The methodology is, of course, flawed, and they don't really actually present any data in this paper. They just say what they did without breaking it down in any way. The context I outlined before shapes what occurred, both historical and contemporaneous, but there is only a fig leaf acknowledgement of this context. There's also a failure to acknowledge that in large-scale internet kerfuffles like this, trolling is prevalent. People on either side, or both, disingenuously engage in order to stir the pot. Big social fusses attract bad actors who see people it's easy to trigger and set off. No attempt was made in this paper to divide sincere disagreement from insincere trolling, and this alone renders any analysis useless. Indeed, this whole fuss, the Dickwolves fuss, started from a blog called Shakesville, which exists, seemingly, purely to shitstir, and has semi-troll status anyway. The runner of the blog is notorious for doing this. And this is about it. You know, this is their entire method. They read a bunch of forum and blog posts with no quality control, and then wrote an opinion piece, an editorial, and said it was a scientific paper. What? It's like saying the editorial page of The Sun is a physics paper. So allow me to present an alternative hypothesis of what happened here. And I'm not even going to pretend that this is scientific, it's just a few ideas and questions and alternative takes on what could have happened and why. I would contend that this is what equality looks like. We have numerous studies, including by Pew Research, that demonstrate that men get equal or more harassment online, primarily from other men, of course, though women are particularly vicious to women online. Male celebrities, with the notable exception of female journalists, especially feminist journalists and columnists, get much more vitriol online than women do. It doesn't fit, does it, to know that men are the majority victims of online harassment, and yet we're told it's a sexist problem. But we also know from these studies that even though men get more online harassment, men are less worried or fussed about it, while women take it much, much more seriously. Less harassment, less abuse, but more angst from it. We also know that while women get more negative sexual attention online, men get more threats of violence, which I would argue should be higher priority. More disturbing. We also know from many studies, including one by Amy Young, that the absence of benevolent sexism is read by women as sexism and misogyny. In other words, treating women the same as men is often perceived to be sexist. An example of this might be if you hold the door open for a woman, they see that as polite or good. If you don't, they see it as sexist. Just an example. In light of all this, I would contend that in the case of Penny Arcade and many other incidents, we're seeing an interloping, colonialist, culturally imperial feminism, amongst other discourses, being rebuffed, and the community treating women and other identity categories in exactly the same way that they treat each other and would treat anyone else. And this is being inaccurately read, due to bias, both ideological and personal, as sexism, racism, etc. This is especially peculiar when we consider that if we want to be, we're all anonymous online. No one need know where we like to stick our genitals or what shape they are. Now, this study goes all the way back to 2012, and things have evolved a great deal since then. We now see a much more entrenched and informed cultural resistance to this online imperialism, and we see the fight spread across many communities. But this is no more anti-woman than the resistance to the evangelical right and the satanic panic in the 80s was anti-white male. It's absurd to even think. And yet one you'll take seriously, the other you won't. Peculiar. In both cases, we see a resistance to an ideology and a cultural movement seeking to colonize and to impose its own social and cultural norms upon a community that is resistance to that, and already has all its own traditions, and so forth. I hope this has been edifying. Let's do another science soon. Zang.
Today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity. Yeah!